When looking at Volume 5 of High School DxD and then reflecting on Season 3 and the first 3 episodes for that, there's definitely some major differences between the anime and the light novel. And when reflecting on Volume 5, it does puzzle me why the anime was done in the way it was. Again, it definitely makes sense why the author was very annoyed with the studio and ended up moving to Passionio Studio for Season 4, especially with how Season 3 turned out the way it did. And to kind of give some major key notes before I get into the sort of more details, is that the major focuses for Volume 5 are Issei's training, Akano and Konoko's sort of backstory, a little bit of their emotions, how they're feeling, how they, come closer to Issei, and then of course Rias and Sonya's little bit of fun rivalry and how they have their back and forth with their rating games, and even how that rating game played out was completely different to the actual anime itself. Honestly, the light novel version does an amazing job of it, and some of the tactics and fun stuff that goes on in that rating game. And it actually really gives some props to Sonya's team in how dedicated they were to try and win. And even though the odds were very much stacked against them, they did really, give a good fight back. And it just showed that those characters got some really good attention that they deserved. And then, of course, the ending of Volume 5 talks about Mr. Creepy Man that proposes to Agia. And then, of course, you had the reintroduction of Ravel Phoenix, which she has a little bit of a crush on Issei, and that's very apparent in Volume 5. There is no Loki in this. To highlight, there is no Loki whatsoever. Of course, they do have the Norse stuff in there when it comes to going down to Devil Society and a bit of the tea party that's ongoing, and there's some, interesting conversations and character building and backstory that goes into all the characters, but there is none of this stuff that ends up being in Season 3, and it really puzzles me why they did things the way they did in Season 3. And when you look at the comparison from Season 5 to Season 3, it feels a little bit janky because they go from the train and then they just teleport straight into this big fight and then they do the training. But in the actual light novels, of course, they've got the new house. They go from the new house to the train itself. They catch the train. They go to the Devil Society. They explain why they need to catch the actual train rather than just teleporting. Then, of course, they have the big greeting, the big sort of fiasco that they have for, of course, Rias coming back home. Then they have the dinner, of course, the mother of Rias and some of her little shenanigans and how she's kind of all giddy and happy about the idea that, Issei and Rias are going to be together. Then you've got sort of them going over the aspirations and the dreams of some of the devils themselves, and Sonya's been the main highlight and focus about how she wants to start up a raiding game school and all of that, and how the higher society of the devils themselves mock her and belittle her for her dreams and aspirations. And then, of course, they go into the training itself with Issei. And then, of course, we have our lovely sensei himself, the dashing devil, the dashing fallen angel himself, coming in, giving advice, breaking down key components that they need to improve on. And the main ones is, of course, Akano and Konoko, because those two seem to have an internal struggle within themselves of what is going on with their past and why they're holding themselves back and not using their full potential, and how they need to accept themselves rather than denying who they are and using their powers to their full ability. So there's the training stuff there. Issei gets pulled out of his training a little bit early, gets taught some dancing with, of course, Rias' mother, which is more just to kind of get him up to sort of the highest standards of Devil's High Society, because Issei's a little bit rough around the edges. The others don't need to know that because they know how to behave in that sort of environment. So Issei's getting some dance lessons, getting told, how he needs to behave at this dinner party, and then the dinner party itself happens, and then there's all the dancing, and there's a little bit of moments between Akano, Konoko again. It seems to be Konoko and Akano definitely have their good moments to shine in this, and they definitely are a bit of a focus. But then, of course, you have them riding there on the dragons. Then Ravel Phoenix makes her reappearance, and she has a bit of a conversation with Issei, and that's where there is, the olive branch. They're kind of, making amends, and they're coming together and making some friendships there, and Ravel kind of hints at her little bit of feelings towards Issei. And then, of course, that's when you end up meeting Konoko's sister. There's a fight. That's when Issei gets into his balance breaker for the first time because he was struggling to get into it. that fight happens, he ends up learning Balance Breaker, and then they go from there into the raiding games. And then again, there's another moment for Akuno and Konako, and that is where Issei learns his new skill, which is him being able to read the thoughts, of course, of certain parts of the girl's bodily region. That is, of course, how Rias's team ends up winning. They go home, and then they meet the creepy dude that ends up proposing to Agia. That to me is basically the whole story, but that's not even how it plays out in season 3 and the first 3 episodes of the anime itself. It's completely all over the place, and it just, to me, when you look at season 3 and the first 3 episodes and you look at volume 5, there is a vast difference already starting to transpire. There's definitely sort of that fork, and they're splitting off, and you can see some of the big differences, but to me it just feels a little bit awkward. I really did love volume 5 because, again, as I said before, there's that big focus on Akuno and Konako and their backstory and how they're not particularly happy with themselves because of the powers that they possess. And it goes into particularly, of course, Konako and her sister and what happened to their previous master, and then, of course, Akuno and her bit of dark past with her father, and I've made videos on that. There's definitely some spoilers there, so if you haven't read beyond volume 5, there are spoilers in other videos if you want those. But I do always enjoy learning more about Akuno because Akuno's always been kind of one of my favorite characters, along with Ravel. Ravel kind of grows a lot more later on in the volume, so you definitely have that to look forward to, and this is kind of her first step moving forward. But I would say Akuno definitely has a lot of growth to do because, of course, she's got to kind of reconcile with her father, and, of course, Sensei definitely talks about that. He talks about how there's a bit of a back and forth between some of the things that he did in the past, of course, Akuno's father, and some of the things that he had done, and that's the first major step at hinting is what is to come. And Akuno definitely having some fun moments with Issei, Rias, and Akuno having their back and forth, their slug match, pillow fights, etc. But definitely we get a lot more to do with Konako and her sister, and then, of course, the Chaos Brigade, and there's that big fight between them, and then, of course, the training partner that Issei had also rocks up as well. Issei goes through a pretty rigorous training exercise trying to really boost up his stamina, and he ends up not being able to get Balance Breaker at the end of the training. It's during the fight with, of course, Konako's sister, and, of course, some of the members of the Chaos Brigade that are working with the White Dragon. There's this whole sort of thing going on in the background, how the Chaos Brigade is sort of trying to do things and people don't really know the full scope of things. Sensei mentions about it as well. So there's that kind of fun stuff that's going on. The last big major thing that happens for me in this volume is, of course, the fight between Sonya and Rias and that raiding game itself, because in the actual anime, the actual raiding game is very simplistic. It's basically at the school again, they have their back and forth, they have their fights, and Rias' team wins. That hasn't changed, but how the fight plays out in the light novel itself is vastly different. Different location, different fighting techniques. Majorly, things just play out very differently because Gasper gets jumped early on in the actual raiding game itself. Sonya has this really awesome tactic, but it all gets unfolded because Issei's new skill, which they end up banning because, of course, no one would ever want to go up against Issei if he can read their minds because of his ability to read the minds of a certain part of the body. That, to me, I felt like really gave a good moment to shine, not just to Sonya, but also to Sonya's pawn himself, and how he was using the leech ability on Issei to drain his blood bit by bit by bit, so he ended up collapsing because of loss of blood. The fact is, Sonya openly admits that they wouldn't have been able to beat Issei in an actual proper brute force fight because Issei is just so determined to keep pushing through no matter the odds. But the fact is, they used a clever tactic, and some could see it as underhanded. Personally myself, I think it's a very clever way of using the mechanics of the games to their advantage. If a certain player loses a certain percentage of the amount of blood in their body, they automatically get removed out of the game because, of course, they've lost. And so that's what they did. They tried to drain Issei of his blood so that he ends up just collapsing, which is exactly it. Not before, of course, he ends up using his magical skills. That, to me, is how the volume plays out. I'd love to know your thoughts in the comment section down below. Have you read volume 5, and what are your thoughts about the anime itself, how the anime plays out, and how the light novel plays out? I do know for a fact later on in the volumes there is much more differences, but I'll be talking about those in their own videos, so have that to look forward to. But again, love to know your thoughts. But if you like this video, hit the like button, subscribe for more anime content, and I will see you, beautiful nerds, in the next video.